Hello TFNation, my name is Chris and this is Muffy and the Mysterians. This is a panel about a collection of weird, long unknown bits of Transformers lore and its history from its development from before 1984. Bit of a red string pegboard sort of a panel, pulling a lot of pieces of information from different scattered things together into the closest thing that we have to a clear picture of this strange little period of Transformers history. Not just Transformers history, in fact, but the history of the transforming robot toy phenomenon in general. And obviously, Transformers is the most famous example of that, and how Hasbro brought it from Japan to America and beyond. Before Transformers and Hasbro, there were Tonka and the GoBots, who just pipped them to the post in 1983. But this panel begins with the story of the company who was almost the first to do it before that, in 1982. That company was named Knickerbocker Toys. It was founded in 1850, and it started out by producing educational toys like alphabet blocks, the building blocks with the letters on the side. But as time rolled on, it became mostly famous for its stuffed animals. And this image that you're seeing now, this is an advert from 1979. And you can see some of the characters in this that the company was well known for, the licenses: Sesame Street, Disney, Raggedy Ann and Andy. Now, the company was founded in New York, and Knickerbocker is actually an old word for someone from New York. But by the time this story takes place in the early 1980s, the company had relocated to New Jersey, and it was currently owned by Warner Communications. That's the parent company of Warner Brothers. Now, the story goes, and that's probably a phrase I'll use a lot in this because of how vague a lot of this information is. The story goes that in 1982, a couple of Knickerbocker executives were visiting Japan, and they discovered the big transforming robot toy craze that was going on there at the time. It had been going on for a while now. It had ramped up slowly through the 70s, and we're in the early 80s, so as far as Transformers directly related things are concerned, Diaclone and New Microman had just started at the start of the 80s. They saw all sorts of different transforming robot toys, but they took a few samples back home with them. And the one that seemed to capture everyone's attention, or at least the attention of the company president, Michael Satan, was a keychain that transformed from a train into a robot. And so the story goes, Satan slid this keychain across a table to a chap named Vincent Baera, and he said to him, and I quote, "I don't know what this is, but there's something here. Do something with it." Now, Baera had worked for Mego in the 70s, and they were the kings of the toy aisle in the 1970s. And he had worked on Micronauts, Star Trek, Planet of the Apes, the DC and Marvel superheroes. So this was a guy who knew toys. He knew a toy craze when he saw one. So off he headed to Japan to do more research, to investigate this phenomenon further. And he saw all sorts of transforming robot toys while he was there. But again, one emerged that seems to have captured his attention, which became the most influential one on everything that followed. And that was a robot named Gold Lightan. Now, this toy was produced by Popey. That's a subsidiary of Bandai. They were the company that made the Machine Robo that Tonka imported and turned into the GoBots. So this was released by Popey in 1981, and it transformed into a cigarette lighter. It wasn't a working cigarette lighter. It was just a little gold box, essentially, a little gold chromed box. But he was the star of his own anime, in which the idea was that this small cigarette lighter could transform into a robot that could enlarge into a big super robot as well. And the show was full of other little robots that turned into normal household items, and there were all toys of them as well. But this seems to have been the one that grabbed Baera's attention. But when I say that it grabbed his attention, I don't mean that he made the decision to license it and release that toy line in America. No. They just took the inspiration for it. They didn't do like Hasbro did and directly license and import the toys and reimagine them for a Western market. They were just like, oh, I like the idea of this robot that turns into a little gold box. And they decided to develop their own line of robots that just turned into simple geometric shapes. and they called this line the Mysterions. If the name Mysterions sounds in any way familiar to you, it's because they basically just stole it wholesale from a 1957 kaiju movie. If there are any Godzilla fans in the audience, they probably know that film as the one in which the robot Mogera, I believe it's pronounced, first appeared. I don't know Godzilla, but and that's a robot that's appeared in other Godzilla material since then. So they just stole this name, and there doesn't seem to be any trouble with it. They called it Mysterions: The Hidden Force. Now, what you see here are early design sketches for these Mysterions toys, plus the card-back illustrations that show the finished figures as well. And you can see they were just ordinary geometric shapes like cubes and spheres, and they were all apparently going to be chromed. And they unfold into these clunky-looking retro sci-fi robots, and they like some of them have pop-out arms and shooting missiles and things like that. The idea behind these robots was that they were aliens from the planet Mysterion. They were the Mysterians with an A from the planet Mysterion with an O. And tell me if this sounds familiar. They were split into two factions, one good, one evil. You had the good Golden Guardians, Goldar, Seekar, and Tinkar, he's the cube in the middle there, and the evil Warbots, Vangor, he's the kind of keyhole-looking one on the left, Blaster, and Destructor, who is the globe, the sphere on the right there. And Knickerbocker had big plans for these. They wanted to do pack-in comics with all the toys. They wanted to have a monthly comic on comic book shelves. And they wanted to do a 30-minute animated special. So to develop the story behind these alien robots, they went to DC Comics. And that made sense because DC was owned and is owned by Warner Communications at the time. So obviously it made sense that the company that owned the toy company, that one of the other companies that they owned would do the comics work. So DC apparently made a sort of proof of concept comic. They drew and wrote something to present. And reportedly, from the people who've seen it, it was described as well drawn, but chaotic and unnecessarily and excessively violent. And apparently it even had a couple of swears in it. So Knickerbocker decided to go to Marvel Comics instead. They went to meet with the editor-in-chief, Jim Shooter. They showed him what DC had created. What I have just described, that was Jim Shooter's quote about the work that he saw. They asked him if Marvel could do better, and Shooter essentially replied, "In our sleep," and he went on to create his own brand new treatment for the Mysterians, totally ignoring anything from DC, just fresh, whole cloth, brand new take. And Knickerbocker loved it. The deal was sealed, and Marvel were the guys who were going to do the comic books. Now, that December, this is already in quite late 1982 we're talking, and in December of 1982, the first issue of Marvel Age magazine was published. Marvel Age was Marvel's promotional magazine, full of interviews and information and solicitations about comics that were coming in a few months' time. And the plan was that the Mysterions would launch in February of 1983. The first issue of Marvel Age contained the solicits for the comics that were coming in March. So this first issue of Marvel Age contained the solicit for the second issue of the Mysterions. And that solicit reads, it's about a trio of otherworldly robots stranded on Earth. Will they save the world or destroy it? The magazine also noted that Marvel creator Dave Cockrum was working on a graphic novel called The Mysterions at the time, and as a result of this coincidence, that graphic novel got renamed The Futurians. Though you will notice that it's actually misspelled Mysterions with an O, which maybe didn't indicate that Knickerbocker was paying the closest attention, and there may well have been a reason for that, which we'll talk about in just a moment. So Marvel were going to do the comics anyway, this was the plan, and Marvel Productions, which was the company that did all their animation, their cartoons, they were going to do this 30-minute animated special, or it may have evolved into a miniseries at that point, we don't really know. Marvel Comics were based in New York, and Marvel Productions were all the way on the other side of the country in Los Angeles. But The thing was, the two companies didn't actually get along very well. See, Marvel Productions had previously been around for 20 years, and it was known as DePatie Freeling Enterprises at the time, and it was its own animation studio. But it was bought just the previous year, in fact, by Marvel's parent company, which was Cadence Industries at the time. So Cadence Industries owned Marvel Comics and bought this animation studio and renamed it Marvel Productions. And the executive producer, the former head of the studio, David DePatie, he didn't like being like a subsidiary or subservient to Marvel Comics. He thought they were, and I'll quote from Jim Shooter here again, that they were amateurish morons who produced garbage. So the two companies were already... they didn't mix together well. So this conflict kind of comes to a head in regards to Mysterions, at least, whenever Shooter and publisher Mike Hobson head out to Knickerbocker headquarters for a meeting about this whole plan. And during this meeting, they have a conference call with Dennis Marks, who was head of development at Marvel Productions. And during this meeting, they discover that because Marvel Productions didn't like Marvel Comics and, thought they could do better, they had ignored Shooter's treatment for the Mysterions and come up with their own completely separate brand new idea for how they would take the idea of this property and turn it into a cartoon that had nothing to do with the idea Shooter had invented and sold Knickerbocker on. And again, Shooter describes this idea of theirs as featuring goofy kids and a dog. Now, something you have to know about Dennis Marks is that he loved to put dogs in things. If you've ever watched Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, there's a dog in that. Spider-Man's Aunt May has a dog named Ms. Lion, who sometimes joins the heroes on missions. Or Dungeons & Dragons, probably a more famous example, Dungeons & Dragons. They were going to put a dog in that until Gary Gygax, the guy who invented Dungeons & Dragons, stepped in and said no. So the compromise was that the dog became a unicorn, and that is how the character of Uni, the pet unicorn who accompanies the kids of Dungeons & Dragons, came into being. All because Dennis Marks's MO was to put dogs in things. But Knickerbocker were not having it. They said, no, we don't want any of this idea you have created. We want what Jim Shooter has come up with. And, Shooter, as Shooter tells it, that left Marks a bit dazed. But the decision was definitely made. But there's another aspect to this meeting that's very important. Shooter describes it as having a strange atmosphere. It started very late, several hours late, because apparently the executives they were supposed to meet with were unavoidably detained with some other business matter. And once it did start, and they actually met the people, Shooter says he describes them as ashen-faced and nervous throughout the whole talk. But they had the meeting anyway, and the conference call with Marks and everything still seemed to be proceeding as normal. And as they were heading back, Mike Hobson speculated that perhaps there was some kind of company shake-up going on, and that was the reason for the delay and their strange demeanour. Well, they soon found out what the shake-up was. According to Shooter, it was in fact the very next day that they found out about this, which was that Knickerbocker got bought by Hasbro. And the Mysterions ceased to be. That was it. The company was absorbed and dissolved into Hasbro, and Mysterions was just nixed. And according to dates from the Copyright Office and from articles about the company purchase at the time, Hasbro's purchase of Knickerbocker literally happened on the very day, the 21st of December, that issue of Marvel Age containing the solicit for Mysterions #2 shipped to comic stores. And then the next month, in Marvel Age issue #2, they had to print a retraction about the Mysterions comic, saying, "The Mysterions will remain mysterious." The toy company folded, and the title was dropped, undoubtedly making it the shortest-lived series on record. Dave Cockrum's graphic novel, The Futurians, would come out later in 1983, and turned out he'd had to rename it for nothing. Now, you are no doubt wondering at this point what any of this has to do with Transformers, aside from the loosest possible connection of the whole transforming robot thing. But there is a very real connection between these two properties, because it turned out that the hidden force, the geometric shapes, were not the only Mysterions toys that Knickerbocker was working on. They were also working on the mobile force, or the vehicle Mysterions. 4 small toys who transformed into little cars and trucks. And if you look at this card art, I think you'll find they're going to look pretty familiar. That's right, the 4 vehicle Mysterions, Truckar, Jeepar, Blazar, and Speedar, are the toys that would become Huffer, Brawn, Gears, and Windcharger. Now, this was only discovered in the last couple of years, and being honest, we still really don't know the full story. We don't understand. What we do know is that we've always known these 4 toys were released by Takara in Japan as part of the Microchange line in 1983, and we always assumed that they were created for it, like so many other Transformers toys. Toys that became Transformers came from the Microchange line. So maybe the gut reaction is to think that Knickerbocker learned about them, licensed them, and were going to release them concurrently as part of Mysterions in 1983. But that doesn't seem to be accurate, because here is the design artwork for Speedar, the toy that would become Windcharger, and this is credited to a Knickerbocker artist named Steve Hodges, and you can see that it's not the final design. The face is different details on the chests, the wheels on his shoulders, they face outward instead of being parallel to the arms. So no, it really seems these 4 guys were Knickerbocker original designs. And I think, knowing this, I think that if you set these 4 next to the other 3 mini-bot molds that Takara did create for Microchange, because there are only 3 of them, Bumblebee, Cliffjumper, and Bumper, and they're all basically the same toy, just with a different shell around it. If you set them next to these 4 Mysterions, you can see that they do look quite different stylistically. Those 3 have all got rubber tires, and the Mysterions guys, they've got hard plastic ones. And the Mysterions guys also have that retro sci-fi robot aesthetic a bit that the Hidden Force did. They have the blank faces with the big visors and the mouth plates. Some of them have claw arms, features that aren't really part of most Microchange and Diaclone and therefore Transformers toys. They are a little bit unique in that regard. And one of the most interesting things is, if you look at Gears and Huffer and Brawn, Windcharger doesn't have this, but these 3 do. They all have sculpted somewhere on their bodies the letter M. And for 20, 30 years, we just thought this M stood for Microchange. But did M stand for Mysterions? So at the end of all this, we're left with this question. If these toys actually were designed by Knickerbocker, how did Takara get them to include them in Microchange in 1983? The toys' patents do say that the Takara designer Hideaki Yoke was their creator. So then, were Knickerbocker working with Takara during the creation of the toys in 82? Did they have the same sort of relationship that Takara would later have with Hasbro, where Knickerbocker would come up with the basic design and then send it off to Takara, and Takara's engineers would turn it into a working toy? Is that how Takara had the designs to include them in Microchange? Or maybe they were working with a different Asian company. Or since Hasbro bought Knickerbocker, and therefore it should own the designs, logically, did Takara then acquire the designs from Hasbro after they entered into partnership with them in the middle of 1983 to work on Transformers together? We don't know. One day we may know, but right now it's just another one of the mysteries surrounding this whole line. Another mystery that spins out of this early era, that's loosely connected to all this, centers on the development of the Transformers cartoon. Now, take a look at this. This is Comics Feature Magazine, issue number 33, published in January 1985. And this has an article in it about Marvel Productions. And this article includes a few pieces of artwork that you can see here of a goofy transforming Volkswagen. Looks a bit like Bugbite from GoBots, but that seems to just be a coincidence. Now, the captions say that this character is named Muffy, and they're from a show called Car and Cable. And we had no reason to believe this wasn't just something Marvel Productions, kind of a knockoff of the... Now that the transforming robot craze was in full swing, thanks to Transformers, it'd be a logical assumption that this was maybe Marvel Productions attempting to create a knockoff to cash in on the phenomenon. That never got made because Car and Cable doesn't exist, this cartoon. It never happened. And you can see it's got the Dennis Marks formula of kids and a dog that they tried to use on Mysterions. And that's about all we ever knew or thought about it. But just earlier this year, a few more pieces of this artwork were found, which cast everything about it into a totally new light. If you look at this piece of artwork, look at the shadow on the floor. That is Prowl's silhouette, or maybe Blue Streak's, but it's the Datsun Autobot mold shadow. And the gun it's holding seems to be a composite of the Datsun Autobot gun and Optimus Prime's gun. You see the chunky back end of it there. Something we thought had nothing to do with Transformers. Suddenly, we realized the implication was that Car and Cable wasn't some knockoff that they came up with later. This artwork represented Marvel Productions doing what they had done with Mysterions, ignoring Marvel Comics' treatment for the Transformers property, and coming up with their own new idea for a cartoon to make out of it. Once again pushing, or maybe even recycling directly from Mysterions, the whole kids and dog thing. Though if that's the case, I wonder why the magazine labelled it Car and Cable, and I think maybe the possibility exists that after Transformers became what it became, they thought they could recycle this early idea of Muffy and these kids into its own show and call it that, and it just never happened. Pure speculation on my part, mind you. And this art that was found gave us a little bit more information as well. We learned that Muffy was short for Muffler, and these kids, the older boy was named Matt, the younger boy was named Eddie, the girl is named Wendy, and the dog was named Bert. Now, speaking of very early Transformers cartoon concept design, here are two more pieces, two very, very early pieces of development artwork for Bumblebee and Cliffjumper. These were found a few years ago before the Muffy artwork came to light. And the question is, were these created to go along with Muffy, with this thing we'll call Car and Cable? They look like they could have fit into the Goofy style, but there is another possibility that kind of overlaps with all of this. Because very early in the Transformers cartoon development, we know that a writer named Jeffrey Scott, who wrote a lot of cartoons back in the day, Super Friends, Ghostbusters, Muppet Babies, Turtles, he wrote a unique Bible and a pilot script to try and sell Transformers to CBS. Now, we've never seen it, but what little we know about Scott's premise for the series is enough to know that it was very different from what the cartoon wound up being. The cartoon would ultimately decide to be sold into syndication rather than to a network, so this network pitch, this CBS-directed vision was dropped as time went on. But we know that Scott's pilot was titled A Robot's Best Friend is His Dog, so still pushing that dog angle, and that it included human characters named Matt Conroy and Eddie Fairchild. Those are the names of the boys who were in the Muffy version. So the question is, was Jeffrey Scott's pilot the Muffy version? Was it the thing we call Car and Cable? Or was it a third version that came somewhere between Muffy and the finished cartoon that we know? Because the fact that it's got this Conroy and Fairchild and not the Witwicky family means that, obviously, whatever it was still in the era when Marvel Productions were ignoring Marvel Comics and coming up with their own premise for the series, recycling characters from the Muffy proposal, and continuing to push the kids and dog angle that goes back to Mysterions and to Dennis Marks into the whole Marvel Productions MO. And if it is a third thing, were the early Cliffjumper and Bumblebee designs created for it? These are the questions. But anyway, in 1984, David DePatie left Marvel Productions, and a lady named Marge Loesch came on as the company president. Now, she smoothed over the relationship between Marvel Comics and Marvel Productions, so the companies could get on with one another. And she also brought on Bryce Malek and Dick Robbins to be the story editors for the Transformers cartoon. Now, the pilot miniseries for the Transformers, that had gone into production already. There was no series Bible for it. So in early 1984, Loesch brings in Malek and Robbins to be the story editors for the Transformers cartoon proper after that. And they did look back at Jeffrey Scott's work. And they were pretty quick to dismiss a lot of it. They say, and I quote, "We strongly considered giving the boy an animal companion for interaction with the robots and to add comedy relief. But we rejected it because we felt it was an unnecessary complication that was overly familiar to viewers." But there is one significant lasting influence of Scott's treatment of Muffy, if they're separate things or if they're different things, on the finished show. And that is Chip Chase, because the decision, the thought process behind adding Chip, a disabled character, a wheelchair user, to the show was as follows, and I quote from internal correspondence here again. "If we include an older brother figure a la Matt Conroy, we might make the younger boy more dependent on the Autobots, perhaps even giving him a handicap. For example, if the boy is partially paralyzed, he might depend on the Autobots for transportation, using jetpacks to get around outside of the vehicles. The boy's handicap would not be emphasized, but could help the writers create more perilous situations, as well as strengthening the relationship between the boy and the machines." And there can be no doubt that that was why they decided to introduce Chip. So even though Chip bears no actual resemblance to these early premises, he grew out of them in that regard. And as far as direct and indirect connections that the Mysterians have to Transformers, that is where the story comes to an end and the evidence dries up. We really don't know anymore. I think someday, I love the fact that even now, new information is still being pulled out of the pop culture mines, and we can still be learning new things. And I think there's obviously more information out there to learn. And I think someday that we might learn it, but right now, that is all we know. There is obviously more to the story, but it's not quite the end of the Mysterian story as their own separate entity. In 1984, as Transformers was taking off, a company named Marchon released a toy line called the Mysterions, the Secret Force, they subtitled it. And you can see these carded samples of some of the figures here. They might look a little familiar. Take a closer look, and we can see that the 6 toys that were released as part of Marchon's Mysterions are Knickerbocker's Mysterion designs turned into physical toys. Across the top, we have the robots that were the evil warbots. Air Commander, formerly Vangor, Bomber, formerly Blastor, and Tank Commander, formerly Destructor. And across the bottom, we have the robots that were the Golden Guardians. Enforcer, who was Goldar, Explorer Scout, who was Seekar, and Major Repair, who was Tinkar. And look at that M logo. Looks very similar to the one that's sculpted into the Minibots. So how did this happen? How did Marchon get these designs? If Hasbro owned them, or if Takara owned them, did they cut a deal with Hasbro? Did Hasbro see no use in these and were happy to sell them off, to sell off assets from Knickerbocker? Or if Takara were involved, did they get them from Takara? Or if it was a different Asian toy company, we don't know. Or maybe the possibility even exists that someone somewhere along the way sold them under the table to Marchon. We don't know. It's just one of the many questions that I've posed for you in the last half hour that we just do not know the answer to. And it's just another one of the many mysteries surrounding Muffy and the Mysterians. Now, that is about all that I can tell you about these subjects, but if you'd like to do some more reading of your own, here are some sources that you can check out. One of the most important is The Toys That Time Forgot. This is a book that was kickstarted back in 2017, so you might have some trouble getting a hold of it, but that is where the design sketches and the card art that you see here, and it's where we discovered that the mini-bots were Mysterions first. Thanks, by the way, to Dan Larson from Toy Galaxy for getting me the scans of the book, because I don't own it myself. You can read more about Jim Shooter's role in all of this on Jim Shooter's own blog. Back in 2011, he did a blog post called The Secret Origin of the Transformers, where he talked about developing the Mysterions and the meeting and the feud, if you will, with Marvel Productions and what DC and Marvel had to do with that. Consumer Collectibles on Instagram was responsible for discovering the Muffy art this year that caused us to completely reimagine everything we thought we knew, and the early Cliffjumper and Bumblebee designs that you saw were found by James Eatock, Serial Geek 77 on Instagram, and he has a lot of other early developmental Transformers artwork up there that you can check out if you go there too. So I hope you've enjoyed learning about this weird and obscure little corner of Transformers history. If you have, you can check out my YouTube channel for my series Transformers The Basics, where I unpack Transformers history and lore, a lot more mainstream than this, the most of it, for fans of all ages. And I think all it remains for me to do now is to say thank you for watching, hope you enjoy the rest of TFNation's big broadcast, and I'll hand you back over to our hosts.